This morning we are continuing our look at the life of Elijah. Kind of the theme for the day is, today is a day with the life of Elijah. In our Bible class, we set the tone for the man's life. You look at the timing of Elijah. And by the way, if you want to turn over to 1 Kings chapter 18 is where we'll be spending the rest of our time this morning. But as you go back and you look at the background for the life of Elijah, you see that it was a very dark time in the history of the Jewish people. The northern tribe and the southern tribe, they have split. There's two kingdoms. The southern tribe, the southern kingdom, they're still somewhat faithful to Jehovah God. The northern kingdom, it has been a struggle. They are getting further and further and further away from the worship of Jehovah with each generation and with each king. And by the time that we get to the life of Elijah, we see that the northern kingdom is being ruled by Ahab and Jezebel. If there were the Natasha and Boris and Natasha of the kingdom world, okay, you guys do not know Bullwinkle. I'm so disappointed. So, if there were two evil people, let's go with that. If there were two evil people in the nation of Israel, it would have to be these two. They have led the people in a revolt against God. They have established their own idols in Israel. It's a mess. It is just an absolute mess. So God sends Elijah to come and enlighten Israel. Elijah is an interesting character. He is a guy that you would look at and you would go, he ain't from around here. One passage describes him as kind of a hairy guy in a leather girdle. He stood out. He has zero social skills, and he's just about as rugged as you can get. But there was one thing that you needed to know about Elijah, and you would know that about him as soon as you met him. He was on God's side. There was no doubt about it. He was a believer in God. He was going to be God's prophet to the northern kingdom. This morning in our Bible class, we talked a little bit about one of the stories about how he relied upon God's miracle. But in this lesson, we want to take a look at that challenge between the battle of good and evil. Elijah came on the scene, and he made a tremendous impact when he first showed up. He made it a point to let everybody know that he prophesied a drought. He said, "It is not going to rain until I say it will." God hides Elijah or takes care of him in kind of out in the wilderness. He sends him to a widow's house, and she provides for him there. And eventually, he has to have a face-to-face meeting with the king. And that's where we're going to pick up with this portion of our lesson. When the drought had made an impact on Israel, Ahab and Elijah called for a summit. And you can imagine the conflict and the probably the bitterness and the contempt that they had for each other. Ahab had been looking for Elijah for a long time, and he finally shows up. And as he walks in, Ahab says, "Look, it's Elijah, the troubler of Israel. You're the guy that's causing all the problems." Elijah looked back at him and said, "I'm not the reason. The reason that there's a drought, the reason that there is a problem in Israel right now is because of you and your ancestors. You have forsaken your relationship with God." Elijah said, "I'll tell you what, let's settle this once and for all. Let's have a showdown." Ahab says, "Okay." So they gather out on Mount Carmel. It's kind of a little point out out into the Mediterranean Sea. And this showdown, interestingly, is not really for the prophets of Baal. They're not for the benefit of Elijah. They're not even for the benefit of the king. As you look at the passage here in chapter 18, this showdown is for the people. Look at verse 21, 1 Kings chapter 18. It says, "And Elijah came near to all the people and said, 'How long will you hesitate between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him.'" Elijah gathers all the people around and he says, "All right, we're going to settle this." And he said, "Here's what we're going to do. I want you to make a decision right now. If Jehovah God is the God of your people, you make that decision. You follow him right now. If Baal is the God of your people, you follow him." And as people are apt to do, they did nothing. The writer says, "But the people did not answer him a word." Have you ever been doing public speaking, and you offer this challenge to people, and you can hear the crickets? Nobody responds. And that's kind of the way that it was. Elijah says, "Okay." I love the phrases that he uses here. The New American Standard Version says, "How long will you hesitate between the two opinions?" There's also a footnote in here that says, it could be rendered, "How long will you limp on the divided opinions?" And I like that. They want to have one foot in Jehovah God worship, and they want to have one foot in Baal worship, and it's kind of like walking in a rut. They really can't get any traction going. How long are you going to limp along not making a decision? All right. We're going to prove it once and for all. Out on the Mount Carmel, the people are gathered. I'm sure that Ahab was there. I would imagine Jezebel was there. But Elijah would be there representing Jehovah God. Did anybody watch the fight last night? I don't know if anybody paid the $100 to watch the two guys go beat each other. But in this corner, you almost kind of get that flavor for what's going on. In this corner, you got Elijah. He's standing there by himself, looking kind of odd. And then over here in this corner, you got 900 people. 450 of them are prophets of Baal. These would be kind of the ones that Ahab would have selected. Ahab had brought in this Baal god. I find it interesting. I did a little bit of research on this god. He probably is the new supreme being of Samaria, of this area. Ironically, it seems like he was the god of fertility and weather. Now think about it for just a second. They got a drought going on. Wouldn't you think if this God had any power, he'd be able to fix the drought? I don't know. But 450 prophets of Baal. Jezebel brings in her prophets. She's got another 400 prophets of the goddess Ashura. She seems to be the goddess of fertility. And also, there is a connection with this. Again, there's some people that believe that there was a symbolic element to Ashura, and it would be fire. If there was an element that kind of described her, it would be fire. We're going to learn more about that here in just a minute. 850 prophets on one side, Elijah on the other side. The people say, "Okay, you have your test. Whoever wins will be our God." Here's what they're going to do. They are going to put up two altars, one to the god Baal, and they're going to build a sacrifice, and they are going to have everything ready for the sacrifice. And the only thing that Baal needs to do is provide the fire. They're going to put up another altar over here on this side. It's going to have a sacrifice. And Elijah said, we're going to have the Jehovah God, we're going to have light this one on fire. Whoever lights the fire is the God of Israel. Elijah looks at the other prophets and say, you go first. They go out, they get their sacrifice, they build their altar, and they start to pray to the gods. And you can imagine nothing happens. I would imagine in the beginning they probably got their, I don't know, this is just kind of as I imagine it. They probably got their chief prophet, and he probably prayed some eloquent prayer, and nothing happened. And pretty soon they probably had a lot of other of the prophets, and they prayed, Baal, send down fire. Show these people that you are the God of Samaria, that you are the God of this area. And nothing happened. And it went until noon. And nothing happened. I mentioned that Elijah was probably not he was probably not first in his class on social etiquette. Look at verse 27. And it came about at noon that Elijah mocked them and said, call out with a loud voice, for he is a god. Either he's occupied or gone aside on a journey, or perhaps he's asleep and needs to be awakened. In the South, we had a phrase, poking the possum. That's kind of what he's doing. He's just sitting over here, just kind of waiting and watching. And he says, you know what, maybe he can't hear. Maybe he's out on a journey somewhere. You need to pray a little bit louder to get his attention. Or, he could be asleep. You know how gods are. Why don't you pray a little louder and wake him up? Well, after noon, they continue to pray, and I would imagine by now there's weeping and wailing and all this stuff going on over here, and they actually are dancing around all afternoon, and it gets to the point where nothing is happening, and they take their swords and their knives and they start to cut themselves, and they're bleeding all over everything. You can imagine this is kind of an icky sight. All this stuff is going on, and nothing's going on. And the people are probably sitting there going, wonder what this means. Elijah probably is not that kind and is not that quiet. I doubt very seriously that verse 27 is the only thing that he said. I would imagine that he would encourage them with his words. Finally, they've exhausted their opportunity. He says, everybody come here. He gathers around the people that are there. And again, this is the focal point. It's not trying to convince the prophets. It's not trying to convince the king and the queen. Elijah is trying to convince the people. He brings the people around him. And there was an altar up here that had already been built to Jehovah God from the generations before. And Elijah prepared the sacrifice. They went ahead and they laid it all out. They sacrificed the animal and they set the wood and everything out there. And he took 12 stones, 12 additional stones, and he set them up there. And then he offered this prayer. Look at verse 36 and 37. At the time of the offering of the evening sacrifice, that Elijah the prophet came near and said, O Lord, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, today let it be known that thou art the God in Israel, and that I am thy servant, and that they have done all of these, and that I have done all these things at thy word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people might know, O Lord, that thou art God, and that thou hast turned their heart back again. You can imagine, once this is all prepared, and everybody's looking and listening to Elijah, and he stands up in the middle of the people, and he says, God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, Israel, God, the God of these people, let it be known right now that you are the God of Israel, that my word is true, and that you're turning the hearts of Israel back to you. Kind of wonder what the people are thinking. They think, man, we got to go all night already? We've already sat and watched these other guys all day long. And now Elijah, we got to spend all night here? I know Ed and Bobby were at Smith's when AmeriGas exploded. They said they could hear it inside. I don't know if anybody else saw it or not. I was working that day, that afternoon, and I was at the middle school and heard the call go out that there was a fire, and I walked out the back of the middle school and I saw this flame coming up. I thought, that's cool. I also thought I need to get over there. So I went around and I got over to where the Flat Creek Center is, and as I pulled up, I could hear the hissing sound. And this flame was coming up out of the ground. And being the bright person I am, I drove even closer. And once I got there, I could feel the heat of the fire. And it dawned on me, you're not supposed to be this close. And so I left. Can you imagine what it would have been like sitting there on Mount Carmel and to hear the amen of Elijah's prayer and have AmeriGas in reverse? Come out of heaven this incredible, incredible fire with the heat and with the sound and everything else that went along with it. Oh, by the way, did I mention that Elijah poured water on his sacrifice? Not once, not twice, but 3 times. The fire came down from heaven. It lapped up the water. It destroyed the sacrifice. It destroyed the altar. What an incredible scene. The pagan gods, they could have prayed forever and ever, and they'd have never done anything. But in an instant, God answered. You can imagine Elijah looking at the crowd saying, okay, what are you going to do about this? They turned on the prophets of the pagan gods. They ran them down and they killed them. At that moment, Jehovah God was God of Israel. Incredible story of the power of God. As we finish up this morning, just a couple of observations from this. By the way, if you want to come back tonight, we're going to talk about a time when Elijah's faith was a little bit different than it was on Mount Carmel. Kind of bring Elijah back kind of in a full circle. We'll talk about that tonight. But as we look at this, I think the first thing that this passage, this story tells us is that everybody must choose the God or the God they worship. God, big G, or God, little g. Now, there's going to be a time, there's going to be an end time in which God's going to make that choice for us. He is going to be so incredibly powerful, and He is going to come into the world with such force that nobody's going to have to make a decision. It's going to be made for them. But until that point in time, each person must make that decision. By not choosing, we've made our decision. Something else is going to be God of our life. But we have to consciously make that decision and go out into the world and say, this is my God. We have to stand before the kingdoms of today. We have to stand before the issues of today. We have to stand before Satan today and say, I am choosing Jehovah God. If you look back at the life of Joshua, one of the great leaders, and I love this passage. When he's standing before the people, he's about to die, and he looks around and he says, choose today which God you're going to serve. Whether it's the God of Egypt that your forefathers served, or the Jehovah God of our people. I don't care which one it is. He did care, but I don't care which one it is, but make a choice today. That challenge is still calling to us today. We have to stand up in front of the world and say, I belong to God. I'm His person. You got to make that choice. I think the second thing this lesson teaches us is it's okay to call upon God to demonstrate that He is God. When the people gathered, Elijah was not, he made no pretense about it. He said, okay, God, show them what you can do. And God wasn't offended by that. God didn't sit up in the heavens and pout and say, well, they should know what I should do. I delivered their forefathers from Egypt. I've done all of this. They should know. No, God said, you give me the opportunity, I will prove to them who I am. Have we ever prayed, Lord, show this world the power that you have? Have we ever asked God to show to this community and to this world and to this society that He is still God? There are all these other little movements and all these other little things that are going on around our world, but He is still the absolute, almighty, powerful God of the universe. How would our prayer lives change? How would our look at the crises in the world change if we really believed and we really prayed for God to show His power? Lord, show us what you can do. We're not going to offend God by praying that prayer. And that leads us to the third point. And that is that seeing God's work in our world should prompt us to action. When the Israelites saw that God had lit the fire, that God was the Jehovah God of the world, they ran out, they chased down the prophets of Baal, prophets of Asherah. They killed them and they came back and they made a declaration, this is our God. When we see God working in our world and in our lives, it should make us want to be more active. It should make us want to go out and do even more for Him. We're not just going to sit back and say, that's cool. God's the God of creation. God's the God of everything. God's the God of power. If we really believe this, we're going to want to go out and make an impact on the world. Being aware of the living God should provide a spark for our lives. Seeing God alive and active in our world should help us to go and do. We're not just going to sit back and say, yeah, that's our God. It's kind of a cool God, isn't He? We're going to go out there and we're going to want to change the world. The apostles watched as Jesus came to the earth. He was crucified. He was raised from the dead. They saw the power of that God that could do that. And they taught the world about His power. About His power over the grave. About His power to save. How would our world change? How would our church change? How would our lives change if we believed in the power of God and it prompted us to go out and do more? I love this story. It's a fun story to tell. It's a fun story to read. But I think it's a story that we need to hear today because sometimes we forget just how powerful our God is. There are all these news reports and all these things going on around us, and it seems like that God is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. But the truth of the matter is God hasn't changed. He's still in control. He's still the supreme being of our world. The question for you this morning is He the supreme being for your life? Each one of us must make a choice. Either choose the gods of this world or the God of eternity. This morning, as we sing our last song, if there's anything that we can do to help you to make a declaration that God is the God of your life, that you are willing to walk with Him, if there's any way that we can help you do that this morning, we ask you to come while we stand and sing.